Good morning, everybody. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you to Dean Bill, Paul Bannister and the team at the Insolvency Service for inviting me to introduce the first paper at this year's Forward Thinking Conference. It's a pleasure to be here in Nottingham. I shall shortly be inviting Dr. Katerina Moser from the Birmingham Law School to step up and present her paper on the dynamics of the cost of living crisis, desperation borrowing, the economic problem of the debt overhang and the changing role of personal insolvency. Dr. Moser has worked at Birmingham Law School since 2019 and she teaches company and contract law. Her research focuses on issues of consumer debt and personal insolvency. But before I welcome Katerina to the stage, I wanted to explain why, for me, this is such an important and timely topic. No one can have failed to notice the current rises in the cost of living. Inflation is at its highest level for 40 years. Interest rates are rising, energy bills are spiralling, rents are increasing, and against this, the reality is that wages have not grown in real terms for many years. As the CEO of R3, the Trade Association for Insolvency and Restructuring Professionals, I and my members, many of whom are licensed insolvency practitioners and their teams, who have extensive experience of helping individuals facing financial problems. We're all very aware of the implications of the current economic climate for individuals and the knock-on impact for businesses. The insolvency statistics recently released paint a stark picture. There were 5,595 corporate insolvencies in Q3 of 2022 and over 27,000 personal insolvencies in the same period. Over the last few months, we have met with many of the leading debt charities to understand what their advisors are seeing on the ground. All of them reported to us that an increasing number of their clients are in negative budgets. By that I mean that they don't have enough income to meet their basic outgoings, yet alone repay their debts. We welcomed the opportunity to submit a response to the recent call for evidence on the personal insolvency framework, having been calling for an overarching review of the personal insolvency framework for some time. For us, the review really needs to go wider than statutory solutions, however, and we really do need to understand the implications for creditors who are owed money. Those who can pay should pay. A successful personal insolvency framework must strike the right balance. On the one hand, it should allow people to get back on their own 2 feet by relieving them of their indebtedness, while on the other hand, it should seek to return to creditors what is owed to them. Barriers to entry, such as cost or lack of access to trusted advice, needs to be minimised, and gaps in provision need to be identified and rectified. Last year, R3's Personal Insolvency Committee published a guide aimed at individuals detailing the options available for dealing with problem debt, covering both formal insolvency solutions and informal solutions such as debt management plans. There is an ever-increasing demand for individuals to be supported where they have problem debt, often facing complex situations, and when dealing with individuals in stressed circumstances, rational behaviour often gets overlooked in the desire to get something done quickly or just to be rid of the problem. The debt charities all reported to us that even when having received a recommendation to enter into a formal insolvency solution, a significant proportion of their clients opted not to do so. Understanding the reasons why individuals get into debt is a useful first step in arriving at a solution. So I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Katerina Moser to the stage. We will ensure that there is time for questions at the end of her presentation and that you will get time for coffee in the morning break as well. So over to you, Katerina.
Good morning. Many thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak about the cost of living crisis in this context. And if you look at the title of my paper, you can already see that ultimately I want to speak about the changing role of personal insolvency. It works. Oh. We're going? Yeah, here we come. So this paper seeks to balance seeks to contribute to one of the key questions of personal insolvency, and that's the question of how shall we balance between the rehabilitation of debtors, the so-called fresh start ethos, and the maximization of returns to creditors, the can pay, should pay ethos. So If we think that personal insolvency should be based on the Fresh Start ethos, then we would promote a fast and generous system of debt relief. If, on the other hand, we want to promote the system of can pay, should pay, rather we would seek to maximize creditor returns by promoting the use of long-term debt repayment plans. And the key ideas underpinning this debate are, for example, mentioned in the Insolvency Service's call for evidence on the review of personal insolvency. So on the one hand, we have the debt overhang problem. Major financial institutions such as the IMF and the Bank of England have now recognized that household over-indebtedness leads to a decline in consumption, aggregate demand, and economic growth. So while this recognition should speak in favor of a fresh start approach, on the other hand, there is fear that generous debt relief would then reduce the availability of credit. And in this paper, I will suggest that under current conditions, the framework of this debate has considerably shifted. We need a fresh start approach, and we need it urgently, but we currently have a level of deprivation that limits the effectiveness of this approach. My argument will proceed in three parts. In the first part, we will look at the cost of living crisis and its reflection in the consumer credit landscape. In the second part, we will look at the relevant economic theories. And in the third part, we will come back to the debate, which I've already opened, and we will ask what conclusions can be drawn from the role of personal insolvency in England and Wales. And when I say we are going to look at the cost of living crisis, we are going to look at it broadly. So we will look at the current inflation crisis, but I also want to highlight the continuing impact of COVID and further factors like our lack of growth and issues of inequality. As you all know, inflation is currently at a 40-year high, and this inflation is caused by supply constraints. And most of these supply constraints have causes outside the United Kingdom, for instance, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nonetheless, and worryingly, the current tightness in the labor market in the UK suggests an economy that is also bumping up against internal supply constraints. And as you all know, the Bank of England has reacted and has hiked interest rates and hopes that this will bring inflation to heel. So until recently, consumers have mainly felt a rise in energy prices and food prices. But since the hike of interest rates, we also faced a rapid rise of mortgage rates and a rapid rise of rents. The cost of living crisis is really felt by everyone, but it has a disproportionate impact on lower income households. And this is because these households spend a much greater share of their income on essentials, and they are also less likely to have a cushion of savings. And we have a continuing impact of the COVID pandemic. The latest data show that the supply of labor has fallen since the pandemic, which may constitute a continuous supply constraint to economic growth. And on the other hand, low-income households are more likely to work in sectors most affected by the pandemic. They are now faced with a cost of living crisis before they could even recover the losses from the previous crisis. And when there are the evil twins of low growth and high inequality. So the impact of the cost of living crisis is worsened by a growth slump that is unprecedented in the post-war period. You can see it there at the slide. We have hardly any growth since the financial crisis. And it is assumed, well, this is not cut in stone, that this is mainly a demand crisis, so a lack of consumer spending. When this decline has been catastrophic for workers' wages and household incomes, and weak growth has been combined with persistently high levels of income inequality. And low growth and high inequality are toxic combinations. As an end result, they lead to real poverty in this country. And these insights are not just theoretical. Already since 2016, charitable organizations observed an increase in people living with so-called negative budgets, where each month their income doesn't cover their essential living costs. So how does the cost of living crisis affect the use of consumer credit? The overall use of consumer credit is reviewed by the Bank of England. And in particular, the Bank of England monitors the share of households with a debt servicing ratio threshold, at which it is deemed to become much more likely to experience repayment difficulties. So that critical threshold is currently at 6.5%, which is very high, but it's still way below the level of the financial crisis. So there's concern, but I think no major concern at the moment. But things are much more problematic if we look at more specific developments. And particularly in this paper, I want to focus on the issue of desperation borrowing. And that's where people borrow to make ends meet. So low-income households increasingly resort to this type of borrowing. Reports indicate that at times that concerns up to a fifth of adults. And people engaging in this type of desperation borrowing typically refer to high-cost credit products, mainly credit card lending. And since 2017, we also experience an increase in the numbers of people being declined for credit. And these people then increasingly turn to methods of illegal money lending. So if we look at the different stages of the cost of living crisis, as I have just described them, we can clearly see how they are reflected in the consumer credit landscape. So you may have read in August 2022, the Bank of England announced the annual growth of credit. Card borrowing was at the highest level since 2005. And then commentators from charities clearly described this as a sign of desperation borrowing, a sign that households were struggling with rising costs across the board. And we could see similar stuff already during the COVID crisis. Many of us could accumulate savings during the COVID crisis, but low-income households had a reduction in their incomes, and they typically filled this gap by increasing to consumer credit. And you can here see a slide showing that low-income households during the pandemic incurred the largest amounts of credit card debt. Finally, there is the issue of increased use of consumer credit by low-income households more generally. And here again, you can see a slide from the Bank of England. And you can see that the Bank of England is not overly concerned about this development, because overall, low-income households only hold a very small share of the total outstanding consumer credit. It's only the tiny yellow bits in the first few sections, so that is not a huge amount of consumer credit. Still, from a policy perspective, the increase of low-income consumer credit is very concerning. borrowing has risen to a much larger extent among lower income households than among higher income households. The median consumer debt repayment to monthly income ratio is substantially higher for lower income households compared to those at the top. And consumer borrowing compounds a high level of financial stress for low-income households. So this is where the debt problems really sit. And this is also becoming obvious if you take into account that the majority of low-income households in consumer debt areas are also behind with multiple types of debt. So we have consumer credit debt, but we also have arrears with rent or mortgage, we have utility arrears or state debt arrears. And this whole issue of the use of consumer credit by low-income households really raises very difficult questions, and maybe I can get some input on that from the audience later on. So, desperation credit clearly is a very bad thing. It can lead to credit spirals, it can lead to mental health problems. But even though taking out credit to make ends meet is highly problematic, not taking out consumer credit might lead to even greater detriment, for instance, to not being able to pay essential bills or not being able to afford food or clothing. What does theory say about this? Before 2007, 2008, before the financial crisis, the idea of increasing household indebtedness was viewed with favor by many economists. And this positive view was based on the permanent income model or the life cycle model. Now, things have fundamentally changed since the fundamental crisis, when academics have moved from the permanent to the relative income model. And as I've mentioned in the introduction, the insights of the relative income model are now widely accepted, for instance, by the IMF and the Bank of England. But one of the key points I want to make in this paper is that it is important to remember that the relative income model focuses essentially on the situation in the United States and in the context of the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So what do these models say? According to the life cycle model and the permanent income model, issues of inequality are irrelevant to the overall level of household consumption. And under both of these models, the use of credit is linked to a prospect of rising household income. The life cycle model assumes that we use credit to maximize utility. We borrow at times when our income is low, but we expect our income to rise going forward, and we save at time when high levels of income have been achieved. On the other hand, the consumption-smoothing theory perceives consumer credit as a form of insurance to overcome temporary income shocks. So both of these models see consumer credit as something positive, but we of course know that life accidents can happen. So it can happen that I take up consumer credit and I fall into a state of over-indebtedness. And then this is very expensive. This causes costs to be imposed on my family members, but also on the wider social community. So if we have a state of over-indebtedness, there is the cost of unemployment, loss of productivity, and the need for increased welfare spending. And then these scholars conclude that debt relief laws should, of course, intervene to introduce the externalities of debt problems. They should not, however, create incentives to reduce the future supply of credit. Rather, the law should proceed cautiously and accept a trade-off, typically underpinning the can-pay, should-pay model. Now, we come to a new model, the relative income model. And the key insight of this model is that inequality matters. The relative income model infers that different groups in society diverge in their marginal propensity to consume, meaning that they diverge in the proportion of their income that they spend on consumption. Top earners typically have a marginal propensity to save rather than to consume, while bottom earners spend a large proportion of their incomes on consumption. Faced with falling incomes, bottom earners use credit to sustain their living standards, while through the provision of credit, top earners temporarily allow them to do so. Now, one important point is that the behavior of bottom earners described by US American scholars is not necessarily identical with that I have described as desperation borrowing. Rather, these scholars focus on the behavior of the middle class. If they speak of bottom earners, they mean the bottom 95% of society. And these choose to maintain their living standards by using credit. So if we understand rising household credit as a mechanism to cope with falling incomes, it can never be welfare enhancing in the long term. When large classes of debtors realize that they can no longer rely on further borrowing to maintain their standard of living, they go into deleveraging mode. And in the best case, that means that they manage to gradually reduce their existing debt to a bearable level. But even if they manage to do so, what we experience then is the famous debt overhang problem. Since creditors have a lower marginal propensity to consume than debtors, this then leads to a decline of aggregate demand and an economic downturn. In the worst case, debtors don't manage to repay, they fall into a state of over-indebtedness with all of the externalities which I have already described, plus very many of them default at once, a risk of financial instability. For two reasons, the proponents of the relative income model promote generous debt relief laws. First, the law should eliminate the negative externalities of over-indebtedness. But second, the law should also create incentives to reduce the future supply of credit, because they think credit is dangerous. And that then leads to a fully fledged Fresh Start model. Having said all of this, what does it mean for us? What conclusions should we draw for personal insolvency in England and Wales? First, there's one basic question. Which of the above models is the best suited to desire the use of consumer credit in England and Wales? I have no clue. Theories are never realistic. And surely each of these models has some relevance in explaining the use of consumer credit. But this should not really bother us. We need to be very clear that the aim of this paper is to draw conclusions about the role of personal insolvency. And it is therefore sufficient to focus on the potential user groups of this system. And with regard to the personal insolvency system, we have very clear data that this system is predominantly used by low-income households. And we can also assume that many of these low-income households have been engaged in desperation borrowing, because that's where the financial problems really lie. And in relation to this specific user group of personal insolvency, we can then assume that the relative income model, which assumes that debtors borrow in the face of falling incomes, is more realistic than other models. So at least that we can say. But then there's the follow-up question. Is the relative income model really adequate to describe the current situation in England and Wales? And no, it isn't. The relative income model is a pessimistic model, but things in the UK are actually much worse than it has been assumed even by this model. So the relative income model says we should pursue a fresh start approach to reduce the negative externalities of household indebtedness. And remember, that includes reducing the debt overhang problem. The debt overhang problem means that we should grant debt relief to boost consumer demand. But remember, at the very start of this presentation, I said currently we have a crisis of supply constraints. And very few people at the current situation would say that we should boost demand. So does this mean that we should not grant debt relief? No. Of course, we should provide debt relief for 3 reasons. First, in the long term, we need to find ways again to boost demand. Second, there are social costs associated with over-indebtedness that apply irrespective of the economic situation. And third, the current users of the insolvency system in England and Wales are usually from low-income households. And providing targeted support to low to middle-income households who cannot employ the coping strategies of higher-income households is the key thing to deal with a recession underpinned by supply constraints. And personal insolvency laws are ideal in this respect, as they very distinctly help those who have already experienced the most severe financial consequences of a crisis. And personal insolvency does that without need for public money, because personal insolvency laws are based on a direct transfer from those who can cope to those who cannot. And lower income groups have a high marginal propensity to consume, but their overall economic contribution is small. Discharging their debt is not going to exacerbate the demand crisis significantly, but returning them into positions in which they can resume spending will be key to the recovery of their local communities. Still, there is a sad thing. I've mentioned the issue of negative budget, of negative incomes. Personal insolvency cannot resolve this issue. For many people, debt relief currently will not be permanent. Final point I have to make. The relative income model wants to reduce incentives for the supply of future credit. Is that something we want in the current situation? There's everything economically wrong with desperation borrowing. But at the moment, I think we are in a situation where I would be cautious to even take high-cost credit away from people. I'm not entirely sure about this, because it might not be the worst option for people who don't know what to eat. But I think this is a theoretical discussion. The truth is, credit levels will go down anyway. I think for many reasons they are in decline, and personal insolvency law has very little to do with it. It has no role to play. And that's quite simply because a system cannot maximize creditor returns if there is nothing to return. People cannot repay. So what personal insolvency law does in that respect is quite irrelevant. Thank you.
Katerina, don't run away. We've got 2 minutes for questions. So do we have a question from the floor first, please? Yeah, if we can have the mic at the front, please.
Hi, Kathy, that was really interesting. For those that don't know me, Sam Roberts from the Insolvency Service. Try speaking into the microphone, Sam. And I can hear and see Dean panicking about what question I'm going to ask now. I have actually got loads of questions running around my head, but perhaps I'll catch up with you later after that. I must admit, from a personal perspective, and I hasten to add, it is a personal perspective, I'm very much a proponent of the Fresh Start approach. But is there a room for thinking about moral hazard aspects in that Fresh Start approach? And if so, how might we consider, so those that might abuse the system to run away from debt, essentially?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's the key question of personal insolvency law. If we want to provide debt relief to many people who need it, we open up the system for abuse. The key point I want to make in this context is that we have currently a cost of living crisis affecting people due to external factors. So people are having debt problems which are caused by factors which are completely outside the range of their behavioral influence. And that makes the discussion of moral hazard much less relevant as in other context. People quite simply have negative budgets. There's nothing they can do to change the situation. So we should really hold back with the moral hazard accusation in the current situation. And generally, we need to look at the context of English insolvency law. So we have about 80% of people now voluntarily choosing to go into a long-term debt repayment plan, into an IVA, while procedures like the DRO, which provides fast-track debt relief, are underused. So we have a long way to go before we can see that moral hazard really is a big problem in the English system.
Thank you, Katerina. We have a question from our online audience. So I just want to remind everybody who's not in the room that actually you can submit your questions online, and if we don't have time to deal with them here, they will be responded to in writing later. But question for you, Katerina, does the desperation borrowing also relate to the increment of salary in the country, the fact that salaries can't catch up with the inflation rate?
Absolutely. That's at the source of the problem. I would say there are two key reasons why we have this increase of desperation borrowing. One is, we have seen that on the slide, we have a fall in wages in real terms. So people have increasingly lesser ability to live from their wages. And then secondly, we have an increase in welfare benefits. Typical people on a negative income are people who receive a mix. They are in work quite often and then receive top-up benefits, but both together is not sufficient for them to maintain a decent living standard.
Thank you, Katerina. And probably not a question linked to this paper, but one of the questions is there's been a 20% decrease in the number of consumer judgments this quarter, year on year, but it was expected to go up. Can we shed light on this?
I can't.
I think probably one of the key answers is that HMRC aren't back to their pre-pandemic petition levels, but there are probably more reasons for that as well. So I think in terms of keeping to time, we will close this session now. Thank you very much, Katerina, for the paper that you presented.